All right, I think we are just about ready to go. Andrea seems to be ready. So I'm very happy to have our next speaker here. Andrea Matrosovs is a former federal candidate for the Liberal Party. As you know, we are nonpartisan, small L, classical liberal, but we do tend to attract a lot of conservatives. So we're very glad to have people from other sides of the spectrum, other parties, other groups coming together, and we think this makes the dialogue a lot more interesting. She's a current graduate student completing her MA in Integrated Studies in Community Studies specialization integrated with adult education. And the reason we've asked her here today is that she's working with the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada, which is an organization pushing for legalization of cannabis. And we think that's a really interesting project, and one that our American friends, of course, will know has taken an interesting development within the past year with some ballot initiatives in a couple states. And for a long time, I think the best argument against, the only good argument against doing anything on drug policy here in Canada has been the reaction of the US and our trade relationship. Whether you think that justifies it or not is an entirely different question. But it's possible that what I think is the only good argument against serious drug policy reform in Canada is going to change with changes in the States. And so we're very happy to have Andrea here today to talk to us a little bit about their efforts, their work, and where she sees the war on drugs and drug policy going. So please help me welcome her.
Thank you very much. Now, do you need me to angle that, or is it good? We're good? How can you hear me okay? Yep. All right. What? A little louder? Yeah. Okay, a little louder. Excellent. Matt, where did you go? I do have these brochures, so if you want to just start distributing them around. I don't know how many are there. They're the last ones that I have, so I'm hoping that's more than enough. Yeah, it will be helpful because it is a brochure about our women's organization, and I will refer to some of the belief statements, etc., that are in that document. So it'll be helpful if you're a visual learner like I am. Then you'll appreciate having something to read along with the discussion that we have together today. I do hope that we are going to have a discussion. I will make a presentation, but I don't want to take up the majority of the time of my time here for this topic just talking. I would prefer that we just get into some conversation and dialogue because I'm very fascinated and very interested to see what your perspective is. The reason that I entitled this talk for Matt about convergence and divergence is because I know when you hear what the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada stands for, you're going to find some similarities in some of the things you believe in, but I also do believe that we need to have a dialogue about the things that don't sit right with you and what you would like to see. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I was really excited when Matt asked me to come because I think this is a very important topic, and I think you have a very important tradition of coming together once a year the way that you do to discuss items referring towards liberty and what that means for all of us here living in Canada. So as an introduction, I just wanted to, I will begin with just my personal story, just very briefly about why I'm here today. So as Matt said, I am the national spokesperson for the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada, but I'm a non-consumer of cannabis. Now, I have consumed in the past in my high school days, and by the time I hit age 19 here in Ontario, it was pretty easy just to go ahead and just have alcohol instead, so I kind of just wandered my interests that way instead. The last time that I used cannabis was about, actually 11 years, because I just had my 11-year anniversary yesterday. 11 years ago, when I was getting married for my second time, my dear friend decided to hold a bachelorette party for me, and all it was just a bunch of suburban moms, because we all had children. My kids were 8 and 10 at the time. And we all got together and we were all drinking and just enjoying our time together and laughing and talking about married life, etc. And then at some point, the alcohol was put aside and somebody brought out some cannabis. So there we were, a group of suburban moms having a joint after we had reasonable amounts of alcohol, enjoying ourselves. The next day, we were back to being suburban moms, taking care of our kids, being responsible Canadian citizens. So to me, that's an epic point, that was the last moment 11 years ago that I actually chose to consume cannabis out of that fluke that one night. But it didn't change who I was and how responsible I was as a Canadian citizen. So that was one of the backstories towards why I am here today. I'm also, as Matt already mentioned, I'm also a former high school teacher. That very much is a part of the reason that I'm here today as well. My story goes back to the Global Marijuana March of 2011. So I don't know how many, have any of you been to that in Toronto? All right, a few hands. So it's a gathering that happens at Queen's Park. Oh, I just want to grab my water. It's a gathering that happens at Queen's Park, a peaceful protest to basically advocate that the laws need to change, and people gather together, and there's lots of cannabis being consumed at that point on the lawn. And then at a certain time, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's quite a large march that goes around. It's all very safely regulated, and the police are alongside making sure that everything goes very well, and it always does. There's always very little incident. About 20,000 people will show up for that. Well, back in 2011, I just happened to be in Toronto, and I happened to know that my son and some of his friends were going to be down at that protest. So I decided that I would just go ahead and just wander over there. When I was a candidate in 2008, not a single soul ever asked me in the 3.5 years that I was a candidate what my views were on cannabis. It was just a non-starter conversation. But in 2011, I went over to this march, and it was not 5 minutes of wandering through Queen's Park when I heard, Madame Matrosovs, Madame Matrosovs. And there, I'm from Collingwood, from 2 hours north of Toronto, sitting in a circle, enjoying cannabis, were a group of my former students. So I went over and I chatted with them. And when I walked away from that, I thought, you know, this is really crazy. We're okay at adult use of alcohol and tobacco, but for some reason, this country is still not bothering to investigate why we should be legalizing the use of cannabis. Those are great students. I remember them. They did really well. They're doing really well now in their young adult life. Why should they have to feel like they're breaking the law because they're choosing one substance over another here in Canada? And that was one of the hypocrisy moments for me that said, no, you know, it's time to actually start being more than just a passive observer on this law. So, Normal Canada happened to have a table set up at the GMM. I went over, paid my $20, and that was my first step to saying, all right, I want to do something about this. My tradition is I'm used to getting involved in politics, so here's one way that I can speak out and say, I no longer want to just sit quietly and watch this law continue here in Canada. In 2011, yes, I was at the Liberal Convention. My son and I were both voting delegates when we were there, when we were part of the 77% that voted in favor of a policy that would introduce legalization of cannabis in Canada. So it was a very important issue, and I actually contacted Normal Canada and I said, are you going to be there? Because if you're not familiar with that acronym, NORMAL stands for the National Organization for the Reformation of Marijuana Laws, hereby NORMAL. And they've been actually active since the 80s, the 70s, the late 70s. 1978, I believe they got established here in Canada. So they have been working towards changing the laws for many, many decades. And so I contacted them and I said, are you going to be there and have a presence and push that delegates consider voting in favor of this? And then what happened is that it turned out at that particular moment in time, the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada was starting up. And so I said, well, this is perfect timing. If you need me, I'm there. And from that point forward, January of 2012, I've been involved with the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada. So you might be asking at this point, why a Women's Alliance of Canada when there was already a Normal Canada? And I have to, you know, there are times when I wonder too, because we have reached out, we figured out, and I'll get into more of the specifics, we figured out that there were some key messages in terms of reaching to the mainstream public, outreach beyond the cannabis community to introduce the idea to Canadians that really the law needs to change. Normal Canada is they have lots of volunteer lawyers working on it. They're very good at working on the actual laws, but it was that just messaging, key messaging reaching out. And there is a Women's Alliance starting up in the States for that same reason. And we found that those messages were missing in Canada as well, and that this would be an opportunity to get it started. That said, I do want to clarify that it's not exclusively only for women. When I talk about our belief statements and when you see the brochure, there are many fathers or uncles or other caregivers. There are many people, either, it doesn't matter what gender, these are issues that are important to everybody. So when I go through them, please keep in mind that I'm not trying to be exclusive towards women. It's just something that was missing and we wanted to fill in that gap on the message. Okay, so that's going to outline what we talk about today, and I will follow through. I'll point out some of the key aspects about what we believe in, and I look forward to hearing at the end what it is that you like and what it is that you don't like. But we are also going to spend a bit of time just giving an update on what's going on in the States, because that does have quite an effect to what's going on here in Canada. And also, recently in the news, there's been some updates on the Canadian side of politics with this topic, very timely this week, so I'm hoping that that will help us engage in a good conversation too. Okay, so feel free to browse through that brochure as we talk, and I'll point out when it is that I'm referring to specifics that either come from that or come from our larger mission statement, which you won't find complete in that document. Sorry, just making sure I don't spill it on this computer under here. Okay. So as I mentioned, I believe that you'll find in that document that there are some common ground items, and there are also some things that perhaps that will further some more robust conversation, which is what I hope. I think Matt says that he likes it when there's good dialogue going on in the weekend. The danger is when groups gather together with common beliefs that everybody can nod their heads and just agree to everything. So I hope we'll have some good conversation from that. There is a tradition of women's activism as well, and it actually does tie itself back to the prohibition of alcohol. I don't want to spend much time on that, but it is one of the driving forces that, and there is a contemporary example as well. Pauline Sabin, for example, was actually a leader of a movement down in the States that actually helped to end prohibition of alcohol. So we often hear that stereotype about the temperance union movements and the women fighting to keep alcohol prohibited, but it was actually also a women's movement who also started putting that dialogue back in action. And it was very much based on what I mentioned, or what I will mention, about things like, you know, Pauline Sabin and her collective movement. They were frustrated because they had seen prohibition for 10 years and they saw their children in more danger and in less safety than they had once when alcohol was not prohibited. So in their particular viewpoint, they adopted the same kind of things that you're going to see in what's happening with cannabis key messaging as well. So the key messages, and this comes from the contemporary movement. I mentioned there's a contemporary example as well. The New Approach Washington, the Washington State movement that was able to actually effectively and successfully get their I-502 passed back in November. For Washington State. The New Approach movement is actually predominantly women who are gathered. Of course, there are men as well. But in terms of who was organizing the movement, it was again these kind of key messages that started resonating. And if you looked at some of the ads and things like that, they were very good at approaching everybody and talking to the fathers and the mothers and the judges and all sorts of people in society that needed to hear the same kind of messaging. There were a few things that came up, and if you do an analysis of the Colorado campaign, the Oregon campaign, and the Washington State campaign, and Oregon almost passed it, they actually came pretty close, you found a lot of similarities. You found messages about keeping communities safer, protecting our youth, regulating it like alcohol, stop wasting law enforcement resources, both human resources and financial resources, and bolster the economy. Those 5 key messages kept coming up again and again. And again, this was one of the reasons why both the Women's Alliance in the States and in Canada got started, to help share that messaging, that there was a lot more to it than just the criminal aspect of cannabis and changing that law. So the belief statement for the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada, you'll see on the front of the brochure, that we do believe that if we could change the laws here in Canada to help tax and regulate cannabis, it would protect our children, keep our neighborhoods safe, and contribute to the Canadian economy. So we can go through those items as we go through and highlight about the reasons why, but I mean, there are some logical connections there too. Protect our children. As I mentioned, I'm a former high school teacher as well as a mother. I'm a mother of 2 young adults. My son is almost 21 and my daughter's about to turn 19. And, you know, and as a high school teacher as well, it became really relevant to me that we were saying it was okay to consume alcohol at the age of 19 and over here in Ontario, but we could never talk about cannabis because it was just not okay to do it anytime. So those kind of things came up when it came to how we present the message to our youth. The other part is too, is that protecting our children is relevant to the idea that, well, if it's not regulated, then there's an underground market. And if there's an underground market, nobody's carding, nobody's checking ID on the street corner, nobody's ensuring that there's some quality to the product that's being offered. So again, there is an issue about protecting not just our youth in that case, but also for quality of product for anyone who might be interested in consuming cannabis. Keeping our neighborhoods safe. There is a connection. Stop the Violence BC certainly is highlighting that there is a connection to increased organized crime, or even just organized crime being able to use the profits from their cannabis industry towards other crimes. So that's another issue that is important, that resonated in the states of Washington as well as Colorado, and are relevant here in Canada too, not just in British Columbia, but right across the country. And contributing to the Canadian economy. Very interesting when you look more in depth about the models that Washington State and Colorado are working on in terms of developing a legal market. Instead of having it as a black market, being able to control it and regulate it and actually promote it as a livelihood for the people that would join that industry. And of course, down in the States, hemp is a big part of that question too, because they have so many more prohibitive regulations about hemp growing than we do here in Canada at this point in time. So with the progress of the U.S., Washington and Colorado both voted in favor in 2012. So if you're wondering, in November 2012, if you're just wondering where they are right now, the Liquor Control Board has done its draft legislation in Washington State of I-502. They've gone through the public feedback process, and it is okay for somebody who's 21 and older to now possess 1 ounce, up to 1 ounce of cannabis. But the retail structure is still being worked out in that draft legislation. So that's where they are right now. And in Colorado, Amendment 64 bills have now already passed, and thanks to what they've been able to pass in that particular case, the first packaged and labeled products of cannabis products and cannabis itself will be available January 1st, 2014. Yeah, yay. Good, somebody's awake. But there is a momentum that's going, and Matt mentioned certainly when the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada has been meeting with politicians, one of the major issues that comes up has been in the past prior to November has been our relationship with the states and how can we do it if the states don't. So it's very interesting how that dialogue is constantly changing, not just because of those two states, but because of what's happening right across the country too. For one thing, the medical marijuana is now being more and more accepted across the states. They're now up to 19 states now, which is quite a bit of progress for them, even though we have it right across our country. Although there's a topic there to explore as well. They have to go state by state to try to make sure that people have access to that as a medical product if they so choose. But there is momentum that's growing there. The other momentum is Vermont, for example, has just signed a decriminalization bill. And I'll speak to decriminalization versus legalization a little bit later. But that's what they're doing as a step-by-step process. So at this point, Vermont is saying if you possess 1 ounce or less, yes, there is a fine, but not a conviction, so that's their progress there. If you're under 21, there is a diversion process, so that's come up again in other states as well, that if you're under 21, that you need counseling or you need addiction information, for example. And then they will work towards the next steps of actually decriminalizing the plants themselves. That'll be their next point when they go, as they continue to move with their progress. Washington, D.C. is also moving towards decriminalization. They're opening up that discussion. And Pennsylvania has governor candidates coming out now and stating policies, and that's becoming a topic as well. The idea of starting with medical, then removing the criminal aspects of possessing cannabis, and then moving towards a regulated system. So it is not just stopping with the two states. And it was very interesting to meet with Normal Canada, with Normal, the international Normal organization in California last year, to talk to so many activists from across the country and from across all the different states, because every state has a different structure. So whereas you can put a referendum on a ballot in Washington State, you can't do the same thing in the eastern states. They have different processes. So it was very interesting to hear how each state has their own way of changing the law. Okay, so destroying the cherished principle of personal liberty is very much part of our mission statement that you'll see in not in the brochure, because the brochure is outreach, so if we put too much stuff in there, we're going to end up scaring people off. But if you go to our website and you click and want to know more and more about us, you will find our mission statement as well. And in there we have destroys the cherished principle of personal liberty. And that comes from the Normal Women's Alliance in the States as well, because we work very much in alignment with what they have identified as important issues. So we do, as the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada, believe that there should be a freedom to choose what Canadians consume, both medicinally and recreationally. And we do believe that that includes having access to accurate research and making an educated decision about that. So if we could get past the abstention issue, which is the part that frustrated me as a former high school teacher, that we just couldn't talk about it because you just weren't supposed to use it, and we could actually provide people with information in Canada, they can make a decision for themselves. It is also part of the issue that there is no harm to others and it does not infringe on the rights of others. Now, there is one interesting aspect that does come up quite a bit when it comes to that, and that's about driving under the influence. And it's interesting to note that Washington and Colorado have taken two different approaches in that particular aspect. In Washington State, the movement believed, the activism movement believed that they would have the best chance of passing the law and making the change to the law if, in fact, they included some sort of provision about driving under the influence. So in Washington State, they did introduce that as part of I-502, and they are working on the details of the per se in terms of how you identify what is the actual THC quantity in the bloodstream that identifies if somebody was impaired or not. But the interesting scientific evidence is that there is a very high threshold on when accidents actually start increasing and what level that is. So they're able to match that up with the data and say, well, it's clear that there are no, no further crashes when somebody has X amount in their system as opposed to Y amount. So that's where they're heading with that. It's not as easy to identify as alcohol in the bloodstream, but it is possible to do that. Now, that was an issue for some of the activists in Washington State, and I spoke to some of them on both sides when I was at the Normal International Conference. Those who actually were not in favor of putting this referendum to the people of the state of Washington because they didn't like that aspect. Particularly people who use it medicinally were particularly concerned about what happens if I'm doing it responsibly and then my levels are different. So it's a very interesting question, and it's the reason why Colorado State decided not to include anything about driving under the influence. So they decided, in terms of trying to pitch, the activists there, in terms of trying to pitch and change people's mindset in their state, that they would have better progress and better success if they just didn't attack that particular aspect of the law changes. So two different approaches, and it leaves us open to be discussing what we might do here in Canada. Two different approaches too, we're also with growing your own. So when the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada says that we believe that it destroys the cherished principle of personal liberty, part of that is opting if somebody chooses to actually not just consume, but actually grow and produce their own product, either medicinally or for recreational purposes. We believe that it should be incorporated, and although we're not policy writers, we're activists trying to get the policy writers to change the law and consider what they can. We certainly have a lot of women in the movement who are very active because they are medical consumers and they have some very specific ideas about what's happening to the changes now and how their freedom to be able to grow their own product, for example, under the previous system is now being changed in favor of more government control. So again, Washington and Colorado went for two different aspects. Washington, you can't grow your own. You can possess up to an ounce, but you'll have to go to a retail outlet once that draft legislation is done and buy it through somebody who's licensed to be selling it, but not actually produce your own. In Colorado, however, for personal consumption, which is considered up to 6 plants, you will be allowed to. So much more closer to, for example, beer and wine here in Ontario, that you can actually produce some for yourself, but the moment you start trying to sell that wine to your neighbor or somebody else, then that becomes a different issue. Giving it away for free, that's an interesting point too. And, you know, I can't think off the top of my head what Colorado's provisions are for it, but that would be worth checking back into because that's kind of a gray area between the two when you don't actually make it a commercial process. Certainly in both cases, in both states, and what we discuss with as the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada is for adult consumption. So if somebody is giving it away, then there's going to be a question about whether or not that's to a youth or whether or not that's to an adult. And I think that might be a topic of conversation for us because you might have different ideas about that. But that is part of the organization that I'm representing, is that we do focus on for adult use. Now, we also in our belief statement also believe, I'll just touch on two other items in our belief statement. We also believe that the current legislation that we have against cannabis is self-destructive and a hypocritical policy that undermines Canadian society. Why do we believe that? Well, because alcohol and tobacco are legal for adult use, but cannabis is not. And as I said, that's part of my personal backstory about why I went from being a passive objector to becoming a vocal activist, is because it did frustrate me that as a high school teacher, we would have these elaborate presentations. Those of you that are part of, I'm 46, so whoever's younger than I will remember those presentations that would come into the high schools with the crashed car on the lawn, and there'd be these mad mothers against drunk driving or students against drunk driving, really effective presentations about what's going on and the dangers of using alcohol, because once you're 19 you're going to be old enough to use it, and this is what you should know, and this is how you should use it responsibly. But we could never have that conversation about cannabis. It was just end of story. In grade 6, they went through the DARE program. They learned that, no, you should never touch that, and that's it. We don't have any further conversation. We couldn't say, okay, if you so choose this over or in conjunction with alcohol, here are some considerations you need to consider about your health and about how to be a responsible citizen and use it responsibly. So it frustrated me that our hands were tied and we weren't allowed to have that kind of educational discussion with our students. And we do believe, part of our belief statement is that it is a mixed and false message that we're sending to our young people. We are looking for responsible use, not abstention, and no questions. So rather than just say don't talk about it, don't do it, we would rather provide young people in our country with the information that they need to become responsible citizens and decide how they use it and how they manage it. And it really does tie back to the idea about tobacco and alcohol as well. We keep coming back to that because it's been the precedent in history that at one point in time, alcohol was prohibited and then it became legal. And yet we didn't continue the movement there, and we just stopped and we just lumped marijuana in with other substances, and we've left it this long up until now, and this is why we really need to change the laws. Okay, so opening a legitimate cannabis market. I've mentioned a couple of issues that are different in Washington versus Colorado, growing your own versus having to go through a licensed state. It's interesting, there could be all sorts of policy talks about how we model a legal and taxed and regulated system here in Canada, and I'm hoping that I'll hear some of your feedback from that today as well. The parties are all choosing their different lines of approach as we speak. A free and open free enterprise, I think that's a topic that I would love to be able to hear your ideas about, because this certainly does come up, especially in the medical community, the medical marijuana community. Those who are using it for medicinal purposes, there is a certain strain they like to use in order to be able to address their particular medical issue. They like to grow it in a certain way. They like the control about choosing how to grow their own, and yet that power to them is going to be taken away with the new changes that are coming with the medical marijuana policies here with our current government today. So it is very interesting because we can expand that argument to what if you're not a licensed retail producer, but you still want to be able to do a small market and begin a farmer's market version of growing cannabis. What could we do with that? How could we make that into a regulated system? And also regulation and taxation. So when I'm saying regulation and taxation, I am referring to a couple of key points for adult use only. And yes, taxation is an issue, and I'd love to hear your ideas on that, because I know that that can be a hot topic for you as well. In one particular state, they were actually so in favor of the idea, they actually want to earmark money towards things such as rebuilding their schools. And I'm sorry, I've just dropped off my head what state that was, but one state made a direct correlation between if we could generate X dollars from the actual taxation of cannabis, we could put it directly towards rebuilding our schools because our schools are in such bad disrepair. So it's very interesting how people talk about what would you do with that money. Certainly in the resolution 117 of the Liberal Party of Canada that was passed in January 2012, it includes things such as diverting some of the money that we would save, the money that would be saved from law enforcement, human resources, and financial resources, and taxation. The two of them could actually go towards educational programming and make it a health issue and provide people with health discussion. So there are different discussions out there about how to generate income from revenue, or how to save it by not wasting it, such as our law enforcement, and then what to do with those particular extra funds. Okay, and then and regulation, as I mentioned, mainly the discussion that we have is about the age, and the reason for that is because that seems to be the first thing that comes out of people when we talk about it. If I meet somebody who is not familiar with the idea of cannabis legalization, the first thing they're thinking, if I say legalization, this is actually a marketing approach that we've learned from the New Approach Washington and from Stop the Violence BC. They said, don't start with legalization, start with regulation and taxation. Because if you say regulation, then people understand it doesn't mean that a little 3-year-old can go to the candy store and buy cannabis along with a chocolate bar. So people start that way. They start that far back, and then you have to slowly bring them forward to the idea of what it could look like. So that is part of the reason why it's very much embedded into our key messaging in terms of gathering mainstream. And I hate using the term mainstream because I think we're all part of the mainstream. But when I say that, what I mean is outside the cannabis community. So we started with a movement of people who were already in favor of using cannabis because they probably used it themselves. And we need to reach out now to voters who either did in the past or have never touched it, but just see the idea that it doesn't make sense to continue to prohibit cannabis here in Canada. And regulating it like beer and wine will certainly be an interesting way to go as well, because if you can look at the kind of structure and legislation and regulation that's involved there, and the taxation as well, but at the same time that you're allowed to, if you're an adult, you're allowed to actually produce your own personal quantity of beer or wine. So to consider that in terms of the grow your own aspect of cannabis, it's an interesting template to bring over and say, what would it look like for cannabis? So in conclusion, the latest polls right across the board in Canada is 65%, even more if you look at the BC polls, who are in favor of changing the current Canadian cannabis laws. BC has excellent polls out there because of Stop the Violence BC and also because of Sensible BC and what they're up to right there. And they've now just gotten permission, Sensible BC has now gotten their permission to go out and start collecting names in order to be able to put a petition together that will allow them to actually put a referendum question in front of voters in BC. So both of those movements have been doing a lot of research in their own province. But if you look right across the country, the latest polls are showing 65%. So it is a very solid majority of people in Canada are ready to look at this idea and think about how to change it. Decriminalization versus legalization versus regulation. I've mentioned some of the regulation aspects that the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada advocates. I will touch on the idea about why we're in favor of legalization and not decriminalization. And we've noticed in the media, for example, there's a lot of interchange of those words, and it's getting a little bit better now because it's becoming more of a current topic. But the first few media interviews I had and the first few contact that we had as this organization began in January of 2012 is using the two terms as if they're identical. So we at the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada do believe that we need to press right for legalization, because if we stop at decriminalization, we're protecting the consumer. They're not going to end up with a criminal record. Now they'll just get a fine or something lesser. But on the other hand, we're doing nothing to help bring what is an illegal and underground market at this point in time into something that is actually fruitful and legitimate in our Canadian economy. So there's no regulation on the side of producing and retailing and selling when we just stop at decriminalization. So that's the reason why we particularly like to forward our thinking right towards legalization, even if there's a step-by-step process. Now, speaking of the current news as well, it is interesting to see that it has come. Certainly the latest of the three parties that I'm thinking of have come out actually making very recent statements. The Conservative Party of Canada has reiterated a statement about keeping families safe. Now, in my particular in my particular discourse, I've just outlined all the reasons why I think, as a mother and a former high school teacher and as a master's candidate in community studies, about why I think our society will be safer if we legalize. So not everybody agrees on what it means to keep families safe, but that is their current statement. The NDP have a decade of resolutions that have come forward every year at their convention towards decriminalization ideas, removing criminal penalties, but stopping there. And we as a nonpartisan organization continue to have dialogues with as many of the parties as we can. One of the reasons why I'm very happy to be here, because I know that you come from all sorts of different backgrounds. But we are finding that there's a stopping block in terms of not making further progress, even though there's been this tradition for 10 years of NDP's policies addressing cannabis. And then Justin has been in the news quite a bit as well. That's right. And it is interesting because the media and the parties in opposition of that particular party, of the Liberal Party of Canada, have been coming out with, oh, you're changing your mind. And yes, actually Justin is, and he's quite identified that he has gone through an evolutionary process. So if I can just share my interaction with Justin and where he's come from that point, I think that will reiterate what it is that he's trying to express about how he started in one place. In the fall of 2012, we as an organization met with all of the leadership candidates of the Liberal Party of Canada because they happen to be going through their leadership. We would have done the same thing if we were in existence for any of the other leadership processes for any of the other parties. So we were there, and what we did over the course of the fall and the summer is we met with all of the leadership candidates with the exception of Martin Cochon, because he jumped in at the last minute and we were already finished going through all of ours. So I'm sorry, but we got to the end of the list and then there was somebody extra on the list. But we managed to meet with all of them while they were still candidates and up until the process when we actually met with some of them when they were still thinking about becoming a candidate. And we did meet with Justin, and that was in November, and he had just announced his candidacy for the leadership at that particular point in time. And when we met with him, he did meet us with some opposition. He was on the decriminalization camp, but he was not as far as legalization. So we had our conversation, much about the ideas that I outlined here, talking about being a non-consuming mother and former high school teacher and why it's important to me and these kind of things. And it was interesting because we had a long meeting, an hour-long meeting, and felt that we were leaving him with more information than he started with. And that's what we offered, is to be a resource, as we offer with any of the politicians from any of the parties with whom we meet. And then there were things that did start to change along the way, and we started to see some differences in some of the statements that were coming out. And certainly we have been, we wrote for the Hill Times and expressed that we're watching the progress of that particular party on this issue because it's a hot topic in that particular party, but we're not satisfied until we see it actually come out in terms of policy. It's one thing to start with the resolution, it's another thing to see it actually get embedded into the policy. So with bated breath, we were watching the progress. And then when we had a chance to meet with Justin later, and he had been coming out with these statements in favor of legalization. He actually said it was a pivotal point for him to meet with us in November of 2012, because up until that point, he thought his mind was made up. And as you've seen in the recent media coverage, and as he said in his own words, he has gone through an evolutionary process that did start to change after that meeting in November of 2012, and prior to that at the convention in January 2012. So yes, I like the fact that politicians are able to change, and I don't want to speak to one particular party just because, you know, my background is from that one. I think that's a healthy change when politicians are listening and they're coming up with new ideas because they've been listening to people who have good things to say to them in different aspects. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why you meet each year, is to talk about what you could do towards changing things here in Canada. It's certainly the reason that I started in politics, and probably am not done with it yet. So that's where we'll be. The Normal Women's Alliance will keep working with all the different parties to try to keep that dialogue open. I'm sorry that Scott Reed's not here, because we've had a chance to meet with him twice, and I really appreciate his point of view and his openness and some of the pieces that he's actually written himself on drug reform. So we will continue to meet with them, and we'll continue to meet with everybody we can, media, public, and politicians, to keep this dialogue going. But lately, it seems to be taking a momentum of its own, and I think it's going to become easier and easier to have this conversation with as many voters in Canada as we can. So that concludes my portion of the afternoon. And I can see a few people kind of moving their hand like maybe they'd like to ask a question. So. Excellent, thank you. So we have a microphone here for your questions.
Start here.
Just a quick point. You were talking about road safety. I think a good way to advocate for that is not going through like probing for THC concentration in the bloodstream, but rather just general attention, because you can be like sleepy or under the influence. Yes. I think a reform in that direction would be great for policemen, because it's way less intrusive and easier to do than just probing for THC.
Excellent. I mean, you know, it's a good point how dangerous it can be if you're too tired at the wheel, or if you're taking prescription drugs that have made you woozy or something like that too. So I think that's an excellent point. And it's the running joke that we have in our community is people who might be under the influence of cannabis over alcohol are actually safer, because they're being very careful on everything that they do. So exactly. Okay, do you want to keep circulating that mic? Thank you.
I know you're talking about marijuana, because obviously it's the easiest one. I approve of the tactics because that's the natural place to start. I'm just curious, to throw the obvious grenade into the conversation, if you will. What's your stance on other drugs, the more addictive ones?
Right. Excellent. You know what? I'm glad you raised that, because I'm also a member. I'm not a spokesperson or an executive member of it, but I am also a member of the Educators for Sensible Drug Policy. And if you look at that international movement, you'll see that there is much more of a broader approach towards not just cannabis, but other drugs as well. And it's interesting how many educators, such as myself, actually question the DARE program that runs through our schools in grade 6, and how it's just a don't do this, rather than saying here's how you do responsible usage of maybe more than just one substance. Portugal, I think, is one of the best things to think about, that they decriminalized the use of drugs, not just cannabis. And they've now been at it for, I think it's now up to 10 years. And although you can still get fined, you actually get you get access to education, and if you need it, to addiction counseling, rather than locking you up and making you and giving you a criminal record. So they've had quite a bit of success now that they've been running for 10 years. So I think that would be the next step. I think you're right. If we start with something simple like cannabis and get the public mindset starting to change and realizing that laws can change, then the next thing is to look what other countries are doing and the success rates that they're having.
I'd like to hear some more of your thoughts on the politics here in Canada. I'm glad that Justin Trudeau came out in favor of legalization, but we've heard candidates and opposition leaders say such things before. It never actually happens when they get into office. I'm just wondering, should he actually get into office, what are the odds that it will actually happen, and what are some of the challenges that he'll face?
Wow, if I could solve Canadian politics in one statement. I think one of the keys that will help with that momentum is when leaders, not just Justin, but when leaders of parties start making such public statements. Because up until that point, it was part of our resolution process. Okay, so 77% of the voting delegates, including my son and myself, voted in favor. That's pretty hard for a leader to turn their back on later and say, no, we're not going to put it in the platform. But it happens. You know, as a candidate, I saw that for 3.5 years. I ran as a candidate, and by the time the writ actually dropped in 2008, all of a sudden items that we thought were going to be in the platform didn't show up. Not that they were saying they weren't going to do them, but they weren't going to put it on paper and say this is part of it. So that's one of the reasons the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada believes in working from now until 2015 to keep the momentum, to keep pressing the momentum, to make sure that if politicians and leaders start talking, that they follow through. And my last Hill Times piece was very much towards that, just in the advent of the leadership selection for the Liberal Party of Canada. That's exactly what I said. Good move, but we're watching. You're not done yet.
I don't know how the rest of them feel about it. I speak as a libertarian for myself only, basically for the group if they want to join me. But my question is, as a libertarian, we need less government, not more. Why does the government even get involved with that? Okay, for the simple reason it has been proven for generations that government cannot run anything successful. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why do we need their approval to grow marijuana? Because I can plant tomatoes all I want, and you know I get sick on eating too many tomatoes.
Right.
I get the gout. Okay.
Yeah.
I drink too much wine. I get the gout. Okay. There's no regulations against that.
Right, and it makes me frustrated when somebody wants to turn their front lawn into a vegetable garden and grow their own food, and then a municipal law turns them down and says, no, thou shalt have grass instead. So
Right, exactly.
another part of my personal background is I had 2 grandparents who were actually libertarians, so there you go. They inspired me to be active when I had viewpoints, and even though we didn't always agree on the same thing and I ended up in a different party, I have heard this before. So,
We're going through a community in bloom, okay? And everybody goes around, the grass got to be of certain type, this high, and if you dare have anything else, the whole organization of municipalities come down on you and find you, and you've got no idea.
Yes. And you know
Thanks.
what? Personally, I am a think outside the box individual. I always like looking at something from a different perspective. So I do like that. In terms of as an official spokesperson for the Normal Women's Alliance of Canada, following the success of the New Approach Washington and what the other states were trying to do and are continuing to do, it appears to be a first step is to change the laws with regulation, and then we can continue to work and think about the regulation. So if we were not offering for adult use only, then we would have a whole slew of people who are now in favor of what we're saying not being in favor because they're worried about the safety of their children. So it's a stepping stone, and that's where the organization has landed itself. Not that it's the only choice and the only approach.
So just to bounce off of what he said, we've done the same thing with alcohol, and what we have now is the LCBO, which is in charge of extracting as much tax revenue as possible, and the beer store, which is privately owned by 3 companies. Are you not afraid that something similar will happen with marijuana or any drug that you plan on legalizing or decriminalizing?
Right. So since we, at the moment, we're just leaving it in the hands of unauthorized people to produce and to sell, and in some cases exploit other Canadians by doing so, we have a problem with that. So if we can introduce some sort of system of regulation, then we can pick the right one as well. I'm thinking, what I'm thinking of right now is the petition that I signed for the convenience store owners. Have you guys signed those petitions that have been going around at convenience stores? Yeah, that they should be able to sell beer and wine. You know, that to me, that's a no-brainer. My husband is from England, and he could not. He thought we were joking when he arrived in England, arrived from England, and said, "So okay, so let's go pick up some beer. Where do we get the beer? At the beer store." Okay, well, we'll just buy some wine then at the grocery store. No, we'll have to go to the LCBO for that. He actually thought we were making it up, especially because it was called the beer store. So why stop? I agree with you. Why stop at that? And you know, let's relax the regulation if we can't eliminate it altogether. But nonetheless, they're still going to card for ID and make sure that you're an adult, for example. So
Ideally, you would want something like a free market, correct?
yeah, and
I don't want to push anything on you, but
yeah. Well, certainly, I love the dialogue about a framework similar to beer and wine, and certainly the Special Senate Committee of 2002, all the way back then, was saying, look, just adopt it like the regulation system that we have for that. I like that. An adult, for example, could choose to actually cultivate their own. Am I going to make my own wine? No, because it's not my thing. I'm just going to go and pay the extra taxes and buy a bottle that's already been sold to me at a retail store. But I like having the choice as a Canadian that I could do it either way. So maybe therein lies the compromise if people have a chance to choose whether or not they cultivate their own or go and purchase their own. If they don't like the taxation issue, then maybe they can then just buy seeds for a lesser taxation and spend the time and effort in cultivating their own product. Maybe there's a solution somewhere there. So
I actually want to congratulate you that you changed a politician's mind. And while I will never vote for Trudeau or any other party, I think it's great that that was happened. And I think while I personally would go for a maximal solution on this whole drug prohibitions thing, I think considering the damage that is done by the current enforcement, even an LCBO model of marijuana is definitely preferable to what is now, because right now you can go to the LCBO and get wine. Yes, you have to pay a higher tax, but at least you can drink wine without ruining your future. So yes, it's distasteful to libertarian to think about that there's another LCBO and it will just be the MCBO. But sometimes half measures are better than no solution at all. So great.
right. Well, and those half measures too, I mean, if we think about it, as I mentioned in 2008, it wasn't even a topic of conversation. Prior to that, you know, some of the decades and some of the political leaders in the States as well as in Canada that have implemented these say no to drug policies, etc., we've gone from that kind of attitude to more and more Canadians and Americans in this particular speech today saying, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. We do need to open the door and start thinking differently. So if that's what we did from absolutely thou shalt not use cannabis to let's talk about it, then you're right. If we then say let's introduce regulation and a regulated system of retailing, then maybe in the next generation the conversation will be, well, why are we regulating it so much? Why don't we loosen up that as well?
And you can still have the social opprobrium to driving stoned. I mean, that doesn't exclude it. You can still have social regulation on it without necessarily throwing it all over it.
Right, just like if you fall asleep at the wheel and end up causing an accident, you are still going to have to answer to that. Great. Please, by all means, I am in no rush, so keep moving that microphone around.
We just have driving impaired by whatever means, and to me that's sufficient for the public safety interest, because sometimes you're blitzed out of your skull, but you may not be impaired. CAMH has done some interesting studies. CAMH has done studies on drug impairment, particularly on marijuana, and for some chronic users and for some people, it's unique. Like any psychoactive drug, it's not the same as alcohol. It's not like a direct correlation for intake. But I may be out of place here with libertarians, but I'm going to endorse the MCBO idea. Certainly, because it's somewhere between beer and coffee. If we're talking a harder drug, would you support convenience stores vending them as well? Is that's in line with the libertarian? I think there's a compelling public interest for regulation. But anyways, that's a 2 cents.
Oh, just follow that mic over there.
Speaking about Mr. Trudeau and his taxation and the idea that we should tax it, and sorry, and your ideas about taxation and regulation, we already have an infrastructure for the marijuana production. How would taxation really replace that? Wouldn't it just continue under in the black market system without the taxation because it's more economical for users?
Right. Okay. So you're saying don't add in the taxation aspect, but insist that current illegal producers fall under some sort of regulated system of quality control, etc., but not add the taxation into it. Is that what you're asking?
Well, no. Either way, the present system is going to continue. They're not going to just stop producing.
When was the
last time you
bought moonshine?
Yeah.
Actually, I used to make my own. I'm a bit of a hillbilly, so I don't know. I've never smoked marijuana though, so.
Right.
But it's the idea that they're not going to just stop because it's against the law. There's a legal way to do it.
Right.
All you'll do is destigmatize it for the people who before wouldn't do it because it was illegal.
And I know that from some of the activists with whom I work who are using it for medical and have their medical licenses, that one of their concerns is what it's going to cost them, because right now they're licensed to produce their own, and so all of a sudden they're going to have to go now and get it from a super producer that's been authorized by the Ministry of Health, and they'll slap on whatever kind of fee to pay for it. So I think you have a big topic. I think that is a whole nother issue. In terms of I think you can separate it from regulation, because I'm actually thinking of Scott Reed about his story about one of the reasons why he's in favor of drug reform was discovering that his grandfather's death resulted from moonshine. It was poorly produced alcohol, and he ended up dying from it. And I live in an area where there was still prohibition until the 1970s in the Blue Mountains, close to Collingwood. You actually couldn't purchase alcohol there legally. So the old ruined house down the road from me was the bootleggers. And that's where they'd bring it all in, and people would drive their skidoos in the 50s all the way down, and drive them back. And, it was just crazy. You had no idea what product was being served to those people. So maybe if we can talk about quality and regulation separate from taxation, and then get everybody on side to the idea of regulating a market. So getting all the consumers out to produce regulated product, and then tackle the taxation. And what rate would you do? 25% they're talking about in Washington State. So that's huge. But then again, so is our alcohol, right?
We're going to have to limit it to 2 more questions, but we're happy to have discussion keep going during the breaks.
Okay. Hello, Andrea. You already know my views against taxation, so I'm not going to speak on that. I wanted to know, you mentioned you met with leadership candidates, but in the same year, 2013, actually, this year, we also had a NDP leadership. So I wanted to hear about if you met with the NDP leadership candidates, and also what kind of meetings have you done with other conservative politicians or green politician or any color politician.
Right. There have been some briefer informal meetings of Normal Women's Alliance members with Thomas Mulcair. I have not met with him personally myself yet. We have been meeting with Megan Leslie and a number of others from the NDP. We're kind of been checking down the list and working with people as much as we can. And we did make sure that we were there at the NDP convention that was recently in April in Montreal. The frustrating part about that is that there was a good resolution that was coming forward again, and we really wanted to see it come and follow through and hopefully have as successful vote as the Liberal one had done in 2012, but it didn't make the floor. They have a different democratic process, and some items just never end up making it to the floor. So we were disappointed about that, because we were hoping that we could have the same kind of dialogue.
Hey, sorry. One of the biggest things that frustrates me whenever you see this stuff in the news, and even in Canada, you hear when there was the Chrétien government had, what was it, 30 grams, what they were discussing, or people are decriminalized at an ounce, or something like that, is pretty much the only real serious health effect from marijuana is the obvious one of smoking, because smoking is bad. Smoking this Kentucky bluegrass is terrible for you. So whenever people talk about these high tax rates, or they talk about, you know, these quantity amounts, they're always in association with quantities that you would smoke, and not throughout the 2,000 plus years that humans have used cannabis. It's almost always exclusively been eaten. This is a very new thing. So what's like does NORML actually tackle that in any way, or try to bring that up, that because a lot of people think, oh great, that's how we'll regulate it, and that's the knee-jerk thing is quantity, but then the government is then therefore inherently incentivizing the least safe and most costly, especially in like Canada where we have public health care context, you know, for the public. It's a terribly perverse incentive. Like, so what's NORML's stance on that, or do you even tackle it, or?
We do speak broadly to the use of cannabis and cannabis products. That Washington State is including cannabis products, or in Colorado, when I mentioned that it's going to be labeled packaged products are going to be available January 2014 in Colorado. It's not just cannabis, but cannabis products as well. And certainly when I went to the International NORML conference down in California, I was, you know, floored with all the different ways in which one can make use of the benefits of cannabis. It is certainly, smoking is not the only way. So if there's a regulation process, they're talking about it down in the States. How do they then make sure that there's a certain quality standard, you know, and also making sure that it's potent enough as well as not too potent too, right? So that when somebody buys whatever product, if they want to consume it and eat it instead of smoke it, that they too know what it is that they're taking. Just like if we choose to take a prescription drug, for example. We want to know what our quantity is and how often we might like to use it in order to benefit for us. So we're not an organization that's prepared, that has the kind of volunteer power behind us in order to be able to actually write legislation. What we want to do is support those who are writing it and give feedback. So such as the draft policy that's come out with the Liberal Party of Canada from the BC Liberal side. We'd love to be able to see more come through and see what it is that they look at in terms of the whole cannabis industry and not just the consumption through smoking.
Thanks very much, Andrea.
Thank you.